Thank you very much.
Isn't it great just getting that response absolutely everywhere you go? This year is the Natural History Unit's 60th birthday, and 60 of anything in broadcast terms is a very long time, and that's 60 years of the BBC, the Natural History Unit, championing the natural world. That's bringing all the thrill of the natural world to audiences all over the world. It also means that the way in which the natural world has sort of informed our culture, informed our humanity even, as well as bringing the wonder of science and discovery to everybody. And in our 60th year, we are sort of uniquely proud to have Sir David with us because, of course, you transcend that whole 60-year period.
I didn't know about transcend, but I certainly was there at the beginning.
and Bristol was there at the very beginning too, wasn't it?
Bristol Natural History Unit, Bristol specialised in the days of radio, and I'm talking about the 40s and the 50s last century, in natural history. And it had a very remarkable man who was responsible, a producer called Desmond Hawkins. And Desmond, when television came to London, the process of spread of television over Britain started in London, then went up to Birmingham, and it was some time before it got down as far as Bristol. But Desmond Hawkins, who had produced remarkable radio programs on natural history, was absolutely on fire to get hold of natural history television, even before television production had spread to Bristol. And with extraordinary ingenuity, he managed to take a concert studio they had for classical music and take an outside broadcast unit to put into the studio so that he could use it as a studio. And he really is the founder. He's the reason why Bristol is natural history.
Now, Desmond Hawkins is very much a sort of unsung hero, isn't he,
yes,
of our history? What sort of character was he?
Well, he was the character of a sound radio producer in the BBC in the 30s and 40s and 50s. It was very much a cultural centre. And the people who went there were people who were interested in literature and in music and in politics and in drama and those sort of things. And Desmond actually was, though he was a passionate amateur naturalist, he was an expert on Hardy and Hardy's poetry, and he wrote rather academic books on Hardy as a poet. But he was also a very good naturalist.
And of course, Hardy had so much natural history in it anyway.
Certainly so.
And another very important figure in those early years was Sir Peter Scott, of course.
Well, indeed. And Peter Scott, natural history started when I joined television in '52. And at that time, television was seen as it would be important and interesting to the public at large because it was live. That was the great thing. It was live, so that if it was going to be about animals, what you wanted to do was to have an animal in the studio and talk about it. And within because it was live, it would bite the person who was showing him or escape or pee down his front or something like that, which was always great. But it didn't tell you a hell of a lot, actually, about real natural history. And Desmond was the person who really decided he would try and change that. But we couldn't use film in the very 1952. We weren't allowed to have film. The only film that they were used in '52 was 35mm, and which, of course, was far too big and cumbersome for natural history work. So Desmond, because he was a passionate naturalist, he knew that there were, in this country, probably uniquely, there was a group of dedicated naturalists who were making amateur 16mm movies. And among them was Peter Scott, but there were others too. Field Marshal Alan Brooke was a great general during the war, but he was also an amateur filmmaker, and he would come in and talk about it. And it was very much amateur, and they weren't using that word as a compliment and not necessarily anything else. They were people who loved doing it and didn't do it professionally, but the result was that they were Peter, who did a program called Look, which was a regular natural history program, the first regular one, would say, in a kind of bumbling kind of way, would say, well, that's very, Lord Field Marshal, could you perhaps give us a chance to see some of what you've taken? Yes, I think so. I can show you some photographs I happened to get, and that was the sort of atmosphere. But it conveyed a passion.
So we've got a clip, actually, one of those early looks, the first piece of natural history film, a piece of behaviour of a woodpecker, where you'll see Sir Peter presenting.
It's a film about woodpeckers, and back in the wood, where the nests are, here is the black woodpecker bringing food to its newly hatched young. The young ones, she carries her food not in the ordinary way in her bill, but actually in her throat here. You see the bill is half open, she's got her throat absolutely stuffed with food, and now down she goes inside the nest. And here is the picture of her inside the nest, like Father Christmas coming down the chimney. She wakes the young ones up and she feeds each one by regurgitation.
Now, just to explain that, Peter had only seen that program. Well, first of all, he said it when he came to the film clips. He came to the studio and saw it in the studio. He was shot by a German naturalist called Heinz Sielmann. So Peter saw what the BBC, how they had edited it, and practiced saying it. He then, the piece of film was then sent up to London, because that was the only place where there was telecine. Peter saw it on the rehearsal electronically for the second time, and then the third time had to give that commentary live. So any idea of actually trying to find the right moment to put the word beautiful or whatever, you couldn't do it. It was Peter doing it off the cuff, live. Extraordinary performance.
And I still think that some of these earliest pieces of natural history are amongst the most difficult things that you can do now. I think you'll agree with that.
Indeed.
Now, but we are going to move on. The Natural History Unit was founded in 1957. But just before we go on, as it were, with the timeline, I met Peter. Years ago, I used to work for the British Antarctic Survey, and Peter, by then, of course, had founded the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, the Wildfowl Trust, as it was called then, at Slimbridge, and I was one of the scientists on South Georgia at that time in the early 80s. And he asked whether we could bring back some South Georgia pintail for his collection, little tiny ducks on South Georgia. And we raised 2 ducklings and to bring back to Slimbridge. And then, of course, the Falklands War broke out, and I and some other field biologists were isolated on Bird Island for some time, still raising these chicks. And then we eventually got picked up by the Royal Navy, and these 2 little ducklings, we were being airlifted from one helicopter to another, going from one Royal Naval ship to another, jumping around, and we eventually got these ducklings to Slimbridge, where I met Peter for the first time, and who found it, of course, that's where I sensed the real passion that he had for natural history, so I could completely understand why he could present like that. But I think you have a tale too, don't you, of bringing
well, the thing that we
waterfowl
said,
back?
yes, I mean, to make it clear, Peter established, he was mad about ducks and geese. And he established in his headquarters in Slimbridge the Wildfowl Trust, it was initially called, in which he had tried to get a pair of every living species known of duck and geese there. And so that was why he wanted the pintail.
And they're still there now. You can go to Slimbridge and see the descendants of my South Georgia pintail.
And I, at the time, had started a series called Zoo Quest, in which we went to different places in the world and made films about these things, but also collected specimens for the London Zoo. And I met Peter in the Natural History Museum one day, and he said, "My dear chap, where are you off to now?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually just going off to Madagascar." And Peter said, "Madagascar, they've got Madagascar teal. I haven't got a pair of Madagascar teal. Could you bring me one back?" "Peter," I said, "of course I'll bring you one back." I don't know anything about birds. What I know about is lemurs and mammals, but birds are a closed book to me. Anyway, so I went off catching lemurs and one thing and making films about them. The program went out, and I met Peter again in the middle of the run. And as he came round the corner, I thought, I'd forgotten all I'd said about the Madagascar teal. See, so I went up to Peter. I said, Peter, I'm so sorry. We looked everywhere. We were collecting lemurs. And unfortunately, I never I never saw a Madagascar teal. And he said, well, I watched your program last night, and I thought it was very, very good, but I saw about 1,500 of them in the back of the
Whoops.
Yes.
And now you'd say hashtag whoops. On to colour, because this is after the NHU was founded, of course. Then colour was very, very important, wasn't it? And I was going to say also, David, is that there was a bit of a tussle with Desmond founding the NHU, because of course you were founding a sort of rival unit in London, weren't you? There must have been a little bit of tension there, wasn't there?
Well, yes. When Desmond established natural history down in Bristol, he was quite senior, and he wanted to appoint someone who would, because he was responsible for programs over the whole range, and he wanted to appoint a head for the natural history unit. And I was producing these programs called ZooQuest, and so I was asked to go down there and become head. But I'd only been in television for 2 years up in Alexandra Palace, but I bought a house, my son was at a school, my daughter, we were well established. And I said, you haven't even got television down there. I mean, you haven't got a television studio. No, I'm staying where I am. And so I didn't become a head of the natural history unit.
You could have been the first
But the person who did was a chap called Chris Parsons, who really established the unit. And he worked under other people. Chris worked under other people who were nominal heads, but he was the best naturalist who came on and took over that job, which you now hold.
We'll talk about Chris in a moment, and of course the genesis of life on Earth. But prior to that, the advent of sort of colour, and
I'm sorry.
No, but it's okay. The first sort of colour film, that was made, of course, was about the Kingfisher, wasn't it, in 67? And of course, this was very, very important to you, wasn't it, in terms of the light bulb moment, in terms of how this could get a lot bigger.
Well, I by that time had left the path of true natural history and become an administrator. So I became controller of BBC Two, and it was my job to introduce colour, because up to that time, the whole of television in this country was in black and white. So I knew that one of the great things in colour would be the natural world. There wasn't any doubt about that. And Chris Parsons commissioned a strange man to make what was his name? Who Kingfisher.
What, who put the Kingfisher together?
Yeah, no, who filmed it. Well, anyway, so I remember the name. If you're 90, whatever it is, I'll tell you. He was a great naturalist. He was a passionate cameraman, and he worked only on 35mm colour.
It says Ron Eastman.
Ron Eastman, so we had a store of colour programmes that we were going to put out on BBC Two. And Ron had done a film about the Kingfisher, and that was actually the first colour natural history programme shown.
Let's have a look at it.
A fine head, white cheeks and throat, with a great black dagger for a bill.
This momentous sort of point in the natural history unit's history, arguably the birth of the super landmark. And you've already mentioned Chris Parsons was very instrumental here. Tell me a little bit about how you were persuaded to get involved in this. And again, there you were in London with a very, very successful operation there, and then the natural history unit had been established, and Chris Parsons turned out to be the bridge, which was one of the most important moments in our history, wasn't it?
Yes. I was controller of BBC Two, as I've said, and one of the things I invented, I suppose it's the case, I wanted a big 13-part series that was going to run 1 hour for 13 weeks and really deal with an important subject. And we would do it on film. It would be a very big sledgehammer series. And I chose for the first subject civilization, because I won't explain the reasons why, and because we haven't got time, but that was the first one I chose. And we invited Kenneth Clarke to do it, and it was a huge success. I mean, it got enormous audiences and got great praise and so on. So we established that as something that BBC Two would do. Every year, at least, it would do a big series. So after Civilization, the next one was The Ascent of Man with Bronowski. And that was another success. Now, I knew perfectly well that the obvious thing to do to follow that was going to be The Story of Life, you know, absolute winner. But by that time, I had been on BBC Two for 4 years, and I was promoted to become director of both networks, in charge of both networks. And I was beginning to feel restive, and I was wondering how long I was going to remain an administrator. And if I knew that if someone came to me and said, look, the history of The Story of Life is a winner for one of these annual big jobs, I wouldn't be able to deny them. It would be absolutely true. But I knew I was probably going to resign, and I couldn't bear the thought that somebody else would do it before I did. So, but if they had suggested it, I'd have had to accept it. But fortunately, we've had just carried on with some other ones. We did one, Alistair Cook, about America, for example. And then when I resigned from being director of television, Chris Parson came to me and said, okay, now you want to do the history of life, do you? So do I. So we got together. That was how it started.
And that was a momentous part. Now, it's very significant for me, and in the conversation that we're having today, is that just sort of rowing back a little bit and mentioning sort of Peter Scott, it was 1961 that the World Wildlife Fund, now called World Wildlife Fund for Nature, was founded, one of the largest environmental NGO in the world. That was founded by Peter Scott and the Duke of Edinburgh, amongst others, in 1961. He were about to go into production of Life on Earth, the sort of the biography of the natural world, and so already then, certainly amongst the great and the good, there was recognition that something was afoot with the natural world. So you're about to embark on this enormous project, Life on Earth, and tell those lovely life history stories, but there was a sense that the human footprint was getting too great on the natural world, hence the foundation of WWF. Have you got any recollection of tension there, or what the world was like?
I think we're now talking about what we were talking about mid-70s, when we started work on Life on Earth. It wasn't a series that was going to propagandize. It wasn't a series with an axe to grind. It was a series that was going to tell the history of life, starting from the very beginning and going through to the end. Indeed, when we tried to sell it, someone tried to sell it to get co-production money from America. I think it was a chap called Michael Peacock who was telling it. He said, and Attenborough's got this idea of actually starting right at the beginning and being very thorough about it. And so 13 parts, and it would go through the order in the way in which the animal groups appeared on Earth. And the American executives said, you mean you've got 13, you're going to have to try and sell 13 one-hour programs, and you're going to start with 1 hour about green slime? No, thank you. You see? But nonetheless, that was what we did. And what is more, now this is sheer boasting, but forgive me, because I've only just been told the figure, at least I've forgotten it. In the end, Life on Earth was getting an audience. We had 2 showings. It was the way in which we managed to afford it by putting in the repeat in the cost. And we were getting, with the 2 showings per week, we're getting an audience of 15 million, you know. And that was a hell of a lot.
On BBC
On BBC Two, yes. 15 million, which wasn't bad.
See, I always thought Life on Earth was on BBC One.
Yeah, well, anyway, that's
yeah.
what it was.
But there was a recognition, so audiences, and it turned out audiences around the world were then delighted by your extraordinary number of think pieces, because perhaps one of the most distinctive things was, of course, having you sort of in everyone's living room, you know, with ants crawling up your trouser legs and that sort of thing.
Well, it wasn't as many as that. In fact, because you were doing a 13-parter, it meant that I could script every program, all 13 programs, before we shot a foot. So that I was able to know, and that way was able to afford, if we wanted to go to Tasmania in program 3 and program 7, we could do that because you could arrange it because you knew exactly what you were. And I was quite precise as to how many times I was going to appear in Vision. And I reckon that every time I had to have a very good reason why I was visible. One was that it was a way of introducing your narrator. Another was that it was a way in which you could take a generalization, a general fact about evolution, for example, and not have an animal picture about it because you're talking about the general principle. And there was the one thing you didn't want to do was to have a person in shot when there was actually better looking at the animal you were talking about.
Well, here we go. We've got a nice clip now of something which Life on Earth really pioneered and changing the image, if you like, of one of the river monsters of the world.
This is a truly primeval scene. At this time, the mother develops a pouch beneath her chin, which will hold about 7 eggs or young. It's tempting to think that the great dinosaurs may have cared just as delicately for their babies.
Brilliant.
Yeah, well, that's an example of once you decided you were going to tell the history of life in a systematic way, you weren't skipping things. And I hadn't heard this behavior of crocodiles collecting their eggs and their babies in their mouths and transporting them until I started reading the research papers on when I came to do the program about reptiles. And it was that very systematic attitude which led us to a lot of stories that would never have been shown on television before, and quite a lot number since. I mean, because you don't look at slugs normally, but in fact slugs are fascinating. If it's an important
slugs
part,
are completely fascinating.
What?
Slugs are totally fascinating.
Yeah, of course they are. I'm preaching the converted.
You are.
But I bet, do you think slugs are wonderful? Of course you do, yes.
I was going to say that, as you know, because all of you experienced conference goers here, you can ask questions. Ben has asked a question here saying, has anything that you broadcast brought tears to your eyes?
Quite a lot of things, really. Yes, I mean, some of it justified, some of it by having just the kind of human attitude toward things that necessarily the natural world doesn't necessarily share. But one of the things that has brought tears to my eyes, particularly elephant sequences. Elephant sequences of a mother looking after her baby newborn calf, for example, and of the build-up which we were able to do because we followed I wasn't there, but the filming was over a period of over a year, and the climax was the baby being delivered. And as it dropped to the ground, it was evident that it was crippled, that it couldn't stand up. That there was it kept trying to stand up and it couldn't stand up. And I know the cameraman said to the director, we can't go on showing this, can we? And the director said, we've got to stick with it, we've got to stick with it, which he did. And of course, the film then turned into how this particular malfunction of the back legs, which actually happens in horses as well as in elephants, is quite frequent. And that eventually this little creature gets over it. And that was a sequence which brought tears to my eyes, as much as the following sequence in another program in which elephants were grieving over the bones of a member of the family who had died a few years previously, and they were picking up the bones one by one and caressing them with their trunks. And that's a problem for a scriptwriter such as myself, because you desperately wanted to say they were grieving. Now, you don't actually have any proof that they were grieving. So the responsible thing you did as a scriptwriter was to suggest that that was a possibility, but not make the anthropomorphic statement that they were definitely grieving. But both sequences brought tears to my eyes, yes.
And I think Life on Earth, which was the kind of genesis of the Super Landmark, one of the great jobs that these series do is to kind of change the perceptions of animals, and you've seen that with a crocodile there. Of course, one of the most viewed natural history sequences on Earth, and I think is your encounter with mountain gorillas in Rwanda for the same series. And it's interesting that one of the impacts of that sequence was to demythologize mountain gorillas. They stopped being King Kong. Suddenly they were an animal that could interact in a sentient way with us. And interesting that mountain gorilla tourism started in 1980 after Life on Earth, and arguably the impact on the fortunes of mountain gorillas was positively impacted by that sequence alone.
I think that was a demonstration. I won't say it was the first demonstration, but it was a demonstration of the fact that human beings were having a damaging effect on the natural world. And the very popularity of that sequence showed how people were in tune. The audience, people are not zoologists necessarily, not ecologists, but people in general had a great feeling about the natural world. And when it was revealed that the natural world, that species, mountain gorilla was under threat. It was reduced to less than 200 animals as far as I remember. And we were able to use that sequence to start a number of appeals, which raised a lot of money and still raising money for conservation. And I personally think that that's one of the most important things that the television can do in my neck of the woods, at any rate. I mean, the United Nations has explained some time ago now that over half of the world population of human beings are urbanized to some degree. That means that over half of the people in the natural world are out of touch with the natural world, and probably some of them would never see a wild animal unless it's a rat or a pigeon from one day to the next. And yet we also know at the same time that this huge spread of humanity, and there are 3 times as many human beings in the world today as there were when I was starting in 1952, 3 times as many, that the effect that human beings are having on the natural world is profound. We're having a great damaging effect. Now, because they're out of touch with the natural world in the way that we weren't 200 years ago, that means that most of us don't see that effect that we're having. What is more, we don't understand the processes of the natural world, which makes this of crucial importance to the future of humanity. So if there's one, the natural history program is marvelous to look at. It's beautiful and exciting, but I would go so far as to say it is extremely important that people around the world should see what's happening. And if the BBC says, and I think quite correctly, one of the proudest boasts is that its news service puts the truth about the natural world to the nations of the world, then I would suggest that one of the other things it can do is, alongside that, is to actually keep the natural world in the minds of the population of this country and indeed elsewhere, so that people should know what is happening to the natural world, should know the damages that it's happening, but furthermore than that, can understand the processes that need to be done, the things that politicians must decide if in order we are going to save that. And that is something that means that your job, Julian, as head of the Natural History Unit, is a very, very important job.
Yes! The natural world is a global commons, is it not? You know, it's not sort of owned, and yet it supports us. It is our life support system. It is that important, isn't it? And I would like to jump way now to the timeline, to this present year, and we will go back in a moment, but to Springwatch, in what Sir David has just said about one of the most important jobs, I think, that natural history broadcasting can do, the Natural History Unit can do for global audiences, is to keep the natural world in their lives. And one of the great things that the Natural History Unit does is Springwatch. It's been broadcasting for over 10 years, and the one thing it does is keep the natural world in people's minds. And last year they ran a story about peregrines. We had a peregrine which was set up so we could track it, and had a camera on the nest so that we could thrill audiences with it raising its chick. But as it happened, up country in the UK, a couple of peregrine nests were persecuted, probably by, well, we don't know, but, you know, who they were persecuted by, but their chicks were left stranded without their parents, and there was a need to find a surrogate parent for these chicks, as it happened, whilst we were broadcasting live. And of course, Springwatch, in that sense, David, isn't it, is a very important programme, and sort of uniquely NHU, I'd say.
Yes. Are you going to show a clip?
We can show the clip first, and then we'll come to it.
To give those chicks the best chance, they need to be reared in a wild environment. So the RSPB were looking for suitable surrogate nests to put them in. And I'm very excited to tell you that they chose our nest to put one of the chicks in. And this is what happened just today. The foster chick was put in the nest at around 8:30 this morning. It's a male, it's 25 days old, so 6 days older than our chick. You can clearly see the difference. It's more mobile than our chick, and it's keen to explore its surroundings. Mum comes in with food. She's been out hunting. And the fact that that female is feeding it just goes to show that it's immediately accepted. Our chick doesn't seem that bothered while it's gobbling down the food. It's obviously very good at sharing.
Looks a bit grumpy though, I have to say.
It looks slightly baffled. His little beak has been put out of joint a bit. But the mum flies off, leaving the two chicks. The foster chick eventually finds a way to hop up. It's a bit of a stare-off at first, but it's not long before they completely accept each other. Both the adults come back, and you can see the two chicks snuggled up. And if you look at that picture now, you wouldn't know that that was a chick that was put in today. I say, looks like a normal peregrine nest, doesn't it, with two chicks? It's brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant. What about that?
Well, now, you see, we're talking about the history of 60 years of Natural History Unit. Throughout that 60 years, to the BBC's credit, that unit has led the world in all sorts of techniques, in all sorts of attitudes, editorial attitudes, as to how you can cover the natural world and make programs about the natural world. And people often say to me, you know, okay, in those early days when it was all live television, now we've progressed through, you've got better and better at filming, but what is the future? And the responsibility of the Natural History Unit throughout that 60 years has been to devise these new formats. And the 13 one-hour series was a new format. But I looked into the future with the proliferation, not only of channels, but the fact that everybody these days really can actually film if they wish to. Everybody. Home video is really quite cheap. And I think that the future of natural history world, not displacing what are the other established genres, but going alongside them, is when people out in the audience also share what they are seeing with other people. And that's the great excitement about the heading of the development of the media and the way in which we now see it. Okay, that there will be the 13-part or the 6-part Sledgehammer series, but people are themselves able to watch what happens in the natural world. I've sat in Australia and looking at some barn owls that were nesting in Oxfordshire by a friend who had put that out there, and I could see it happening. And so it's very important that the audience take natural history as something that natural history broadcasting to, something that they themselves can do and contribute to. And it's not just a few privileged people who are able to make these programs.
And it is theirs, you know.
And it is theirs.
The global
so that's where and so I take off my hat to Springwatch, because and in Autumn Watch, for developing this new genre, which nobody else yet, as far as I know, has elsewhere in the world has yet copied, have they?
No, and we just pushed out Wild Alaska Live, which
good.
is a sort of a powerful derivative of that. But yes, you're absolutely right about keeping the natural world. I just want to pick up on something that you mentioned there about broadening the audience, because Springwatch in some ways looks very traditional when you see that sequence which was broadcast live there. But of course Springwatch has got a whole community around it, and the social media activity around Springwatch and all the other digital activity which takes place, as well as running live cameras on the web and what have you. And going back to our point that we made in the early 60s, when a few, in a way, very sort of powerful people in the know, thinking of Peter Scott again, knew that there's something afoot with our footprint on the natural world, something which has happened with the broadening of broadcasting, which this community of people have been talking about over the last couple of days, into the digital space, means that an enormously wider group of people know of the issues too. So it's going from an elite few to today in 2017. Is that power, David, that in your view can be harnessed? This is power for good, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the responsibility to your predecessors, really, that the unit has historically been developing these new techniques, these new attitudes, these new formats, and Springwatch is one of the latest. And there may be more up your sleeve for all I know. But certainly Springwatch is a marvellous example which the rest of the world has yet to cotton on to.
And with that sort of widening audience, that audience of many ages, because we know that younger people are passionate about the fortunes of the natural world, with the younger audiences, with the new audiences knowing much more about the jeopardy and the fragility of the natural world. In terms of that footprint that you were talking about earlier, is there hope that a much greater sort of group of people now are aware of the issues?
Well, I think we spend a lot of time, I spend a lot of time wringing my hands and saying how dreadful it is and how this forest has been obliterated and that sea has been polluted and whatever. But there are signs of hope. I mean, and it's rather almost like the way that suddenly, to me at any rate, the knocking over of the Berlin Wall was a surprise. I had no idea that was build-up was approaching and that suddenly it was going to be the end of an era politically. And I have the sense that worldwide, certainly in Europe, certainly in China, which we never thought before was concerned about this. And perhaps even, if I may say, there are people in America, Pache, Mr. Trump, who don't accept that human beings can do no wrong and that you can simply exterminate a wilderness. People who care about the wilderness in the United States. And there has been a worldwide shift, I think, amongst people in general about the concern that there should be for the natural world. I am encouraged more than I have been for some time.
I mean, there's several questions here about how can the BBC engage younger audiences more in natural history and those stories around the conservation of natural history. And I think we're addressing that with that, aren't we?
Yes, and the balance has got, I mean, we've got to be careful that not every programme that we put out is grinding an axe. We've got to also remember that there is joy and delight and beauty and pleasure and excitement about the natural world, which is our bread and butter. That's what it's about. And if there was no need to talk about conservation, the happier I would be, and that we could just actually relish it and enjoy it. But that isn't the case. If we are responsible, we have to take on this responsibility.
I want to take you back to 2006 and Planet Earth, because we talked about the super landmarks, birth of super landmark with life on Earth. Planet Earth, which came in 2006, took the game to a much, much higher bar, where we were having a view of the natural world in a way that we hadn't seen before. And just wanted to say that one of the great jobs of the super landmarks is to give big audiences escapism, to give them awe, to give them wonder, to give them the view of the natural world. And I just want to show this clip of Planet Earth from the Rivers episode before I talk about it with David.
$400,000 greater snow geese flock to the estuaries along the Atlantic coast of the United States to rest and refuel on their long migratory journeys. This is the end of the river's journey. Collectively, they've worn down mountains and carried them to the sea. And all along the way, their fresh water has brought life in abundance to planet Earth.
What I was going to say about that is that sort of innovation, isn't it, has been at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, every time you start on a big series, you think, what new piece of knowledge is there that we ought to be showing, but also what new development, technical development, is there that we ought to be taking advantage of. Sometimes it's slow motion. It has been using starlight cameras to very low light levels. But the one that Planet Earth won, the first series, Alistair Fothergill was in charge of, he had discovered that there was a camera mount that you could put on the bottom of a helicopter, but which was so vibration-free that you could use very long focus lenses. So that meant, I mean, as you all know, helicopters make a terrible noise, so that if you're flying above animals in the African bush, and the helicopter is low, the noise of it frightens the animals. Also, the downdraft beats the vegetation down. So that's really not practical. And yet there's things you really need an aerial shot to explain. But the point about the Camiflex was that you could put it on the helicopter, and even at a high level, you could get a close-up of a wildebeest. And you also were able to get wide-angle shots like those of snow geese. And so just occasionally using it throughout the series gave the whole series a lift. Somehow it came a new series. It was a new look. And that's one of our problems. I mean, the problems are how far can you go on in actually with using technology to give your series a lift. You can't go on forever.
But of course, technology is the heart of innovation in natural history. I've always felt that natural history is the art of the close-up. And Alistair, said he could frame a wolf's eye from 1,000 feet using that geostabilized device, which of course now used quite routinely. And innovation, of course, extends to time-lapse. Enormous advances now going on in macro, and all of which, of course, are getting us closer and closer to the natural world. Our time has come to an end so quickly with Sir David. I was wondering, David, before we show a clip which we put together especially for this audience, whether there is something that in the last 5 years that you are most heartened about in terms of our relationship with the natural world. One of the kind of sub-themes of what we've been talking about is
status. The one thing, I suppose, the big achievement in the last 5 years, people used to get very upset that we couldn't get international agreement on so many conservation issues. And I used to say, look, never in the whole of history has nations with different attitudes and different philosophies and different languages and difficult political systems got together to agree on one particular problem, on solving it. Well, in fact, the first time when that happened was harking back to Peter Scott, something that Peter himself dedicated his life, the last years of his life to, and that was the International Whaling Commission. He got people around the world, the maritime nations around the world, to agree that whales were being exterminated, and this would be a crime beyond description, and that nations must stop whaling if the whale was to survive. And nations around the world did so. And they did so at knowing that it would actually rob them of a certain amount of national income. So that was a huge advance. And I think that the Paris Agreement represents another big advance. And I would like to think, just harking back to what I was saying earlier, that the reason that political figures can adopt that sort of policy, which they know will be at a cost to their national economies, is that they are beginning to realize that people worldwide wish that to happen because they wish to protect the natural world. And I think that that feeling has been helped a great deal by what your unit and other units around the world are now doing.
What I'd like to do is just, as we close, is just show you a clip that we put together for you, right up to date, of some of the natural history unit's work. Thank you, David. Thank you very much, everyone. David.